All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are recording. Thanks to Vanessa for reminding me to hit record before I went on yet another unrecorded educational experience with you guys. So what we're going to do today is the first roughly hour, Alex and I are going to talk with you about academic publishing and specifically it's sort of the moral dubiousness surrounding the academic publishing industry and its practices. And this is relevant for you guys for a lot of reasons. At a basic level, it's part of the business of research component of the unit. Like, you know, a lot of what we're doing is looking behind the scenes at how the research industry kind of works, because it's not obvious from the outside. But also, this is really about stewardship and about you guys understanding what happens to the knowledge that you and your colleagues produce. As we'll see, there's a really dangerous disconnect between the product that is produced and the process that is behind that product. Leads to some really unfair profit gouging and, you know, putting knowledge behind, publicly funded knowledge behind private paywalls and things like that. So hopefully people were able to look at the readings for this week, and if you weren't, we're going to go through them a bit, but you're really encouraged to go through at least the two readings that we've set. They're the sort of easiest RD1 readings because it's a blog post and a Guardian long read. And unfortunately, if you read them, you might kind of be rinsing the taste of vomit out of your mouth for quite some time, because the academic publishing industry is, well, a complete disgrace, to put it sort of mildly.
It's also worth saying here that this bookends something that we introduced you all to in week 0, which is that hidden process of publishing. You know, when we looked at the Hawking Lab in week 0, one of the things that we realized was that there were all of this kind of machinery going on in the space of authorship that was obscured in the final product of research. And here is the another large element of the machinery that is obscured, which is the industry that exists to support scholarly and scientific publishing. And I guess it's worth, probably like we said to you in week 0, but it's also worth saying at the outset here, as if it's not already obvious, that we think it can be different. And one of the reasons we have this content in RD1 is to provoke you to think about, is this the right way we should be doing publishing? And can I do anything about it as a steward of my field, essentially?
Yeah, and we're not we're certainly not saying that people shouldn't publish in for-profit journals. It's not that simple, of course. Your career sort of requires it. What we usually say, though, is if and when you publish in for-profit journals, you should feel dirty and you should feel sad, because it perpetuates a system that's grossly unfair. But so what we'll do, just before we look into the actual articles themselves, we wanted to just so we're all on the same page, kind of lay out. This is just a single sort of slide turned into a PDF. Very simple kind of step-by-step thing about the academic publishing process. This will just set up the rest of our discussion. So researcher, or plural, researchers work to produce a research paper and send it to a journal, right? And all of that work takes place, by and large, as part of the work of a university job. You know, there are research institutes and other things that are the kinds of organizations that fund research, but in the main, this is what we're talking about. University academics getting paid by the university, which means getting paid by the taxpayer. They do the work of whatever kind and send something to a journal. The editors sort of assess it and review it and determine whether it's suitable for the journal, and if so, they'll arrange for peer review. And in most instances, the journal staff are volunteers. Alex, do you maybe want to talk about your experience as editor of the Journal of Sociology, just to sort of highlight the sort of honorariums and some of the actual like publication company staff and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I've been an editor of three or four journals now. The Journal of Sociology being the biggest deal. Journal of Sociology is published by Sage. I was managing editor of the Journal of Sociology, which was a paid position, actually. It's the only paid editing position I've ever had. And when I was managing editor, Althea Possami Anesity was the editor-in-chief. That was a voluntary position.
How much was the payment for the managing editor?
It was 6 hours at the casual professional staff rate, which I think was something like $42 an hour or something like that. So 6 hours a week, like that was the entire kind of salary to kind of manage a journal and publish it. And what that involved, of course, was accepting hundreds of submissions, thousands, in fact, of submissions a year, well over 1,000 submissions a year, that you have to communicate with authors, you have to find reviewers. And the idea is that as an academic, that this is part of what's called service. This is part of your service as a steward, as a researcher, as a person who wants to cultivate knowledge in the world, that you serve, you volunteer like this to help in the production of knowledge. That it's a kind of, it's a very useful element, because what it reminds people that they can't just kind of go and do their investigative research and then kind of spew it out into the world. It does take quite a bit of labor to get your writing to the people who need it the most. But in that role, the reason why I was paid for the Journal of Sociology was because that journal was published by Sage. Sage is an academic publishing house. And that meant that while the editor-in-chief and the editorial board and the authors and all of the peer reviewers worked voluntarily, there was still costs at various points of the end use of the article, which we'll get to in a second. So essentially, that's the back end of a journal, is that it requires an editor-in-chief, or sometimes two editors-in-chief, two co-editors-in-chief, to steer the journal, to make sure that it stays within its scope, that it publishes quality over quantity, although we'll get to that as well. And it has an editorial board, which is usually about a dozen people who are volunteers who help shepherd individual articles through the publication process, while the editor-in-chief kind of looks over everything. And it has a pool of reviewers who actually read the articles with a fine-tooth comb and provide comment on whether they should be changed, accepted, rejected, basically advising the editorial board on what should be done with the article. And all of that labor, and you can think about how long it would take to really finely read a journal article. That's what we've been teaching, kind of not so much teaching you as recommending that you do with slow reading. Like that, it's a lot of labor to go through a single article as a reviewer. All of that is voluntary. That is, it is not paid. It is taxpayer supported by virtue of being part of your role as a university scholar. Some people, of course, in professional roles in government and in private industry, act as reviewers and editors and authors as well, but they're much, much rarer. The vast majority of scholarly and scientific publishing is done by paid academics like me and Jack.
Yeah. And there's something like in this report here, which is linked in one of the papers that we're going to look at. It's like a industry report on scientific journal publishing. This is Science, Technology, Mathematics, I think. It says somewhere down here.
Of the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society up the top, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. The very first one by the look of it, volume 1. There you go. I think it says in here that there's about 110,000 here. The industry employs an estimated 110,000 people globally. That's the scholarly publishing industry. So there's a lot of people involved, like doing the technical stuff as well, and the accounting and all of those kinds of things. But the actual, it's important to say that the actual academic work, like very, very, very few of these 110,000 would be doing the intellectual labor required for the eventual items, and they're all people who are supporting the infrastructure behind that mechanism. So we'll come back to that a little later. So yeah, the article is reviewed, and then the researcher and the editors kind of do the final changes and whatever. And this is where one of the paid people might come in, a typesetter, someone paid by the journal to format it correctly for the visual layout of the journal, which is quite a technical process by the time you get into professional typesetting.
Yeah, hashtag nobody uses Microsoft Word.
Yeah, you're probably using InDesign or similar types of typography. Yeah. Now this is the crucial point though, because once it's all done and ready, when you sign a contract, that's what you have to do, right? You have to sign over like the copyright of the paper to the publication company. There are some exceptions to this, but in general, that's what you're doing. And that means, as we'll kind of go through, that this private company gets ownership, full legal ownership of this thing that all they had to do was pay some editors to typeset something. That was about it. There's no other industry where you just get given a valuable product for free. Like that. It's insane, right? It's insane. And then the journal charges a subscription, and that means when that's to libraries, right? So libraries will buy big bundles of journals, which will include all the articles, or lots of people have experienced this, especially people who are outside academia, but they're doing some research on something. Articles have a fee. Articles have, you've all seen this, the sort of $30, $40, $50 for a journal article, which is insane. It's absolutely insane. But of course, people outside the academy don't have the image of research as this big kind of professional organization and or like the industry. And I assume a lot of people think, gosh, that's expensive, but aren't morally outraged. Like they must think, well, there must be a reason why this is so expensive. There's no reason. That's the point of today. There's no reason why it should be that expensive. So the two things that we wanted you to look at were, I've got some PDF versions here. I actually thought that might be a touch easier to go through. But these are all in the week 10 folder. Well, these are both in the week 10 folder on views in ID1. And it's worth just sort of dwelling on. We're going to look at Schmidt first. This is Jason Schmidt. This phrase here, can't disrupt this. The whole point of
just before you go on.
Yeah, please.
It's worth noting here that the processes are almost identical for book publishing. I'm not sure if you mentioned that. But for books, there's a slight difference usually in that there is the potential for the author to get paid. Whereas in journal articles, you are paid nothing at any stage. Nobody is paid. Reviewers are not paid, editors are not paid, and authors are not paid. That is, no royalties accrue to you. With a book, however, it is possible for you to sign a contract with the publishing house where you accrue royalties. I, for example, have made my millions with my own book, Spiritual Tourism, which I think at last count, I had been paid royalties in the order of about $250 in the 10 years, nearly 10 years since it was published. And that's because, of course, the market for academic books is tiny. Compared to kind of, popular fiction and so forth. But it is there. I should also say that I've signed a contract and published a book, edited book with a publisher called Brill. And that, I remember signing that contract, and that was one of the first moments where I felt really ripped off by the industry, because I signed a contract that explicitly said I would accrue a 0% royalty on sales. And that book, I should see if I've got it here actually. I don't know, I don't, it's at work. That book is like it's a thick book full of edited chapters, and at release it cost 260 euros to buy. And I remember thinking, you're charging 260 euros and I get all of the hours of work that I put into that, and I get 0%. Like, that's my cut of that work. I felt really jibbed by that.
Rightly so.
Anyway, digression, sorry.
No, that's not a digression. That's a
Paragression.
That's what, yeah. I've coined a new term, paragression, which is when it's not a digression. It's like you're on the same track, but it's just a bit to the side. But it's relevant. So, all right. We're not going to read the whole thing, okay? I really, really, really want you guys to go and read both of these articles if you haven't. But let's have a look at a couple of things, right? So we're talking. This is it's a really good title. Can't disrupt this. What they're talking about is that, like, the seeming impossibility of disrupting and dislodging these big publishing companies from their position of dominance. And what's especially interesting is this setup here. I'm gonna just zoom in a bit more. Yeah, let's do it like that. So 20 years ago, in 1995, now 25 years ago, there was this prediction that the internet would basically kill the academic publishing industry, right? That once you had the dispersion capacity of the internet, academic publishers were screwed, and people believed that, and the stock price tumbled, and everyone was like, oh yeah, well, obviously the internet is going to radically democratize knowledge. But then it turns out 20 years later, one of the clear winners of this longitudinal timeline of innovation is the very firm that investors, journalists, and forecasters wrote off early as a casualty to digital evolution, Elsevier. We should say as well, this publishing house was formed in the Netherlands in about the 1770s or something. It's got a really ancient heritage. Like a lot of companies now, it's been bought a whole bunch of times by different people. So it's, you know, sort of long past those origins. And if you want a random little piece of trivia, I believe that this part of the name here, Sevier, is related to the same etymology as the English word zero. So it's got an Arabic derivation. You can look into it. If you look up Elsevier, you might learn more about that. Anyway, that's a digression. That's not a paragression. That's a digression. And that the strength of this mob is better than ever. The health is stronger than ever. And you got to just read this carefully. The academic publishing market that Elsevier leads, so not Elsevier itself, but Elsevier leads it, has an annual revenue of $25 billion. But this is the real kicker. According to the financial documents, Elsevier's own financial documents, in 2013, it had a higher, I can't click this, otherwise it's going to take me to the links, had a higher percentage of profit than Apple. So think about that. The world's most valuable company, Apple's got like $70 billion, or maybe they've hit $1 trillion. I don't know. They've got more money than anyone. The academic publishing industry is operating at a profit margin of like 35%, which is insane. And this is a really great encapsulation. We'll get Alex to say a bit more about Brian Nosek in a second, and some of the work that he's doing. But let's just read this paragraph here, because this is the heart of the problem. Okay, this is the heart of the problem. Brian Nosek, a professor at the University of Virginia and director of the Center for Open Science, says, academic publishing is the perfect business model to make a lot of money. You have the producer and the consumer as the same person, the researcher. And the researcher has no idea how much anything costs, right? Because no one ever did an MRes. No one ever got told this stuff. Nosek finds this whole system is designed to maximize the amount of profit. I, as the researcher, produce the scholarship, And I want it to have the biggest impact possible for my career. So what I care about is the prestige of the journal and how many people read it. Okay? Think about that word, incentives. Incentives. Everything is about incentives. Once it's finally accepted, and since it's so hard to get acceptances, I am so delighted that I will sign anything. Send me a form and I will sign it. I have no idea. I have signed over my copyright or what implications this has, nor do I care, because it has no impact on me. The reward is the publication. So we've set up this disgusting, morally abhorrent system where researchers have zero incentive to consider the fact that the publicly funded knowledge they produce is just being signed over to a private organization who's going to charge astronomical, globally kind of leading profit margins, profit markups on this stuff. And universities never, ever, ever raised it. This is not, you can't go into a promotions meeting and say, hey, I've been publishing in lower quality journals because I disagree with the morals and ethics of the big publishing companies. Like, we'll talk, you actually could get away with that if it's a long-term strategy potentially. But the point is that universities also don't care. They're in a game of prestige where even though they're organizations, they're just organizations staffed by people who are on fairly short contracts, especially the 5-year, 10-year vice chancellor contracts, where their main aim is to increase the university's KPIs on metrics like how many things did you publish in these journals. So at no stage in any of the system is there any incentive for anyone to go, whoa, hey, what about like democracy, justice, fairness, health, quality of life, and like the collective human project? Like, what about that, guys? So this is the problem. And this is what I mean about vomit in your mouth. This is like, it's so sad, not only that this happens, but that no one talks about it. So,
well, until very recently, nobody talked about it. You know.
Yeah. So go on about that, Alex.
So one of the reasons it's important that Nosek is quoted early in this piece is because Brian Nosek, as it says there, is the director of the Center for Open Science, is also one of the founders. The Center for Open Science is a really interesting group. Basically what they are trying to promote is a process whereby we do scientific publication that does not necessarily or doesn't incentivize participation in the model of publishing that we've just laid out to you. What they're interested in doing is, like the name says, being as open as they possibly can about scientific work. And one of the things they're interested both in the problem of scientific knowledge being behind a paywall, because what we haven't talked about here yet is that after all of that process of going through the publishing an article and signing over your copyright, the fundamental problem is that you have produced work, you've produced knowledge about the world, something that can be valuable to other people and help them think about the world better, but they can't get to it until they pay you, until they pay Elsevier or Sage or Springer some money. And you might think, cool, well, yeah, whatever, it's a couple of bucks, but it's not a couple of bucks. Often the case, a single journal article will cost upwards of $60, $70, $80 American.
Well, tell the story again. We might have told it at the start of semester, but Journal of Religious History. This is insane, guys. This is insane.
Yeah, so the Journal of Religious History, which I was very briefly also a kind of editor, kind of sub-editor for, again, a minor. I was paid as a research assistant, and one of my duties as a research assistant was to help with the Journal of Religious History. Journal of Religious History is owned by Wiley Blackwell, another large publisher, also involved in academic publishing, and is administered by the Religious History Association. And at the Religious History Association annual general meeting, the year I was part of it, there was a presentation from Wiley Blackwell because our contract with them was up for renewal. And I went into that meeting as a minnow who had no responsibilities for voting or anything like that, just as an observer. I went into that meeting thinking, cool, well, obviously we're going to pitch to Wiley Blackwell about why it's great for us to publish with them. And when I got in there, it was the other way around. They were pitching to us about why we should keep them. And I thought, this is strange. Why are they pitching to us? Like, what's in it for them? And then they delivered the financials. And part of the incentive for the Religious History Association to stick with Wiley-Blackwell was essentially a $250,000 check, which was our cut of the royalties. That was the kind of the cream off the top of their profit that they were going to give to the Religious History Association from 1 year of downloads, article downloads. That was our incentive to stay with them, $250,000. And I asked, like, where does this money come from? And the account manager that was pitching to us said that basically, libraries around the world had bulk subscriptions to Wiley-Blackwell. That is, that they would pay Wiley-Blackwell. We don't know how much, because it's there's a non-disclosure agreement with almost all academic publishers, so that we can't legally find out how much is paid. Even at Western Sydney, we can't find out how much is paid to the various journal publishing houses that we subscribe to. But that those made up of the profit that the Journal for Religious History made, those made up something like 50% of the profit. The other 50% of the profit was single article downloads. That is where somebody who's not a subscriber clicks buy now, pays whatever it was back then, $50 to download one article, one 8,000 word article, and saves it as a PDF. And I asked, who's downloading this? Because surely all universities can access this for free. And the account manager said, yes, they can. Most of the people who download do single downloads work in government, and a small percentage in industry. So think about that loop that's going on. The taxpayer is paying for the university staff to produce the knowledge. The university staff then the university also subscribes to the journal so that it can buy back the knowledge that it produced. And then employees in government or government also buys back the knowledge that it paid to produce. And if you scroll up a bit there, Jack, the $25.2 billion industry, that's $25.2 billion mostly of money that is allocated to universities that could otherwise potentially go to research. When we talk about there being a shortfall of research money, that's part of the problem, is that we're spending millions, billions worldwide, subscribing to journals that feed us the knowledge that we have already produced. This is a problem.
This is a problem. Yeah. Absolutely. So if we keep skipping through this a little bit more now, I've just kind of noted a couple of key points here. I mean, this is a further illustration of the problem here, that then because all of this dynamic is so unknown and untalked about, like, researchers will get up in arms and talk about intellectual freedom and all of that. If universities stopped subscribing to things or stopped paying those exorbitant fees, there'd be backlash. Again, you could avoid that with a proper communication strategy and a global sort of strategy, but this can definitely happen without that. Take note here, although Elsevier is the publisher that everybody likes to hate, I love to hate them, I have to say. If you look at Taylor and Francis, Wiley or Springer, they all have the same kinds of practices. So just any of those kinds of groups, look, and if you see a publishing company who you don't know, it'll only take you 3 minutes of clicking to sort of work out whether they're a open access foundation or a private company. So this is also really, really relevant, just to keep driving this point home. Heather Morrison, professor in the School of Information Studies, University of Ottawa, talks about the business model of Springer. Says, if you look at who owns Springer, these are private equity firms. They've changed owners about 5 times in the last decade. Springer was owned by the investment group Candover and Kinven, who describe themselves as Europe's biggest buyout firm. So, like as it goes on to say, like these companies who buy companies to decrease these are companies, all right, who buy companies to decrease the cost and increase the profits and then sell them again. That's fair enough in some sectors of the economy, but here in research, the exact same thing is happening. These research papers that everyone produces ultimately form a commodity in the kind of realm of like big business at this kind of private equity sort of level.
And that's a really timely point, like right now in Australia, because right now, guys, in Australia, universities are in a really awkward place. We are not classified as businesses for the government purposes, so universities are not eligible for JobKeeper to help us through COVID-19. We're also not charities, so we don't have the tax concessions available to us to act in a way that can allow us to survive, that charities have access to. And so right now we're dealing with this problem of being told to operate like a business, but having to operate like a business that is constrained in the same way as a charity is constrained, but with none of the benefits of either category. It's something that, to their credit, the various vice chancellors around the university, especially ours, have been really active with government on. But like that's where we are right now. That we have all of this going on, which is problematic, and then we still have to participate in the world of business like this, and have all of this expenditure, which probably, it's our contention, Jack and me, that we don't need to spend this. We could do this publishing work for much less, certainly much less than $25 billion a year.
We could easily get that down to 22 or 23. So here's another horrifying part of the process, right? Where you just think, who are these people? Like, who are these humans out there? And then you realize, well, they're just normal humans, and it makes you sad about humans. This negotiate individually, all right? This is a really key point. There is no pricing list for these journals, right? So let's just say Elsevier has like, I don't know, 3,000 journal titles. They probably got more, but let's just call it 3,000. It's not like each one of those has a publicly listed price, or that they're packaged in it. Like there's no public information about it at all. It's because they negotiate individually with each institution, and they have non-disclosure agreements with those institutions, so they can't bargain. So that they, being the institutions, like our library, for instance, can't bargain with Elsevier knowing what others pay. So in every single negotiation, the customer, the institution is blind and has to decide whether they can bear the cost that Elsevier is going to impose on them, right? And this is like, we've asked our research librarian. So there's a couple of senior research librarians. There's obviously a head librarian and then a head of research librarian. And we asked the research librarian if she could sort of tell us the figures, because we told her about this week that we give in RD1, and she was like, no, I can't say anything about it. I'm sorry. And not even kind of off the books. We haven't. I reckon, over a glass of wine you might be able to get it out of her, but not in a formal sort of setting. So there'll be, I've never looked into this fully. There will be some kind of line item in the university's budget that's part of the library's budget that is about that says how much we're paying, but there's probably no indication about how many publishers that's spread over, how many, any of the information. It will just be one big, like, this is how much we're paying for subscriptions. So non-disclosure agreement is brutal. And then they talk about the they're talking about royalties. If you wanted to read that paragraph. And so this is another, just emphasizing this point, right? It's precisely the prior lack of a pricing and value barometer, that's like publicly available prices, that leads to the complexities associated with disrupting the main players in academic publishing. So let's just slow read that sentence. It's precisely the prior lack of a pricing and value barometer, which is the thing we were talking about above, that leads to the complexities associated with disrupting So we want to, if you want to disrupt the main players, there are complexities. It's not as simple as just saying, don't pay them. And that this non-disclosure situation is a really key part of what gives them so much strength. All right, that's what that means. And here's a great point. Adam Smith's invisible hand works to lower prices and increase productivity, but it can only do so when valuation or pricing is known, and the same thing is true for disruption. You can't value something if you don't have tiers of a market.
It's one of the great truths of economics is that capitalism operates on the assumption that you charge what the market can bear. And one of the ways that the market knows that it can bear things or not is by understanding what the rest of the market is doing. Like there's your own self-evaluation as an organization or as an individual, according to your own budget. There's only certain things you can afford, of course, but the market isn't individuals. The market is a collective. And the presumption of an open market is that everyone roughly knows what everyone is paying. And that case does not obtain in academic publishing at the moment.
So this is the rub of it as well. This is a really nice quote to sort of summarize what would need to happen to change this. Okay, which we can still talk about further, but as a basic picture, right? Who's Sundahl again? David Sundahl at this is a pretty cool name. I should have pointed that out actually. The Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation. That does sound a little made up, but it's a pretty cool title. So he is saying, to revolutionize academic publication, a new system would need to be developed in a basement market, that is a sort of a startup kind of market, which would eventually enable people to gain enough credibility doing this new solution. It's a slightly odd phrasing, but people would then begin to value this lower end, well done research, and that is where the world starts to change. So what he's basically saying is that if you were going to disrupt the Elsevier model, what you need to do is establish a system that has its own credibility and build it from the ground up. That's built on sort of different principles, right? Now, again, we have all those incentive factors before at the moment. A lot of people who benefit, including senior professors and senior university managers, they really benefit from the current system. And have very little incentive to change it unless they were the kind of social justice advocates that they often say that they are.
There's a further kind of troubling point here, which is that one of the ways that academics, this is a kind of outgrowth, I suppose, rather than a paragression. One of the ways that academics are measured is not just that they have published or that they have published in a reputable journal. Another way that academic performance is measured is on things like citation, like how many people have used your work to do their own work. And of course, so then you need a measure, like how do you measure citation? And it might seem pretty straightforward that you count the number of times you were cited. Well, the question is who does the counting? Well, it turns out that Thomson Reuters is the main company that does the counting. Thomson Reuters owns the academic metrics company called Scopus. And so Scopus does the counting for a lot of academic citational measurement and impact measurement. And so you would then think, oh, okay, well, that's fine. They count all of the citations, but no, they don't count all of the citations. They count all of the citations that are in their own database. And yet we have a situation in Australian universities, for example, where alternative measures of counting things like citation have to be argued for, but Scopus doesn't, because Scopus has established that it's a big business with a good commercial relationship with university libraries, and so it's trustworthy. All of the other measures, like Google Scholar, for example, are less trustworthy than the commercial measure. And this is the point I'm getting at, is that because large corporations are involved, there's a certain amount of trust that comes with that, and that's probably worth, that's an interesting sociological and macroeconomic point, that large corporations at the level of government have a lot of trust. But the problem here is that, like, I ran into this really early in my career, that I was denied a promotion essentially because my citation count was too low. And I said, "What are you talking about? I've been, I'm, what was it by then? 4 years out of my PhD, and I've been cited, 70 something times. I can't remember what it was." And they said, "No, you've only been cited twice." And they were going off the Scopus database, and I was going off the Google Scholar database. Google Scholar is much more accurate than Scopus because it's open. It counts everything that it can. But that was just one instance of, a minnow like me being affected in this way. It also comes into things like grant applications, where you have to argue for the impact of the work that you've done prior. So you have to participate in this system, is the point that I'm getting to. And the system sets itself up because it's a good system in the sense that it's a system that exists to support itself. And it supports itself very well through participation, not just in the publication, but in the measurement of publication as well. And maybe a bit later, Jack can talk about the European Union and their drive for open publication and open science, and who they chose to lead that.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, we'll get there soon. But I also want to just continue thinking about this from a high level and point out to you guys how strongly the lessons from week 6, Foster et al., that reading, how strongly all of that plays in here, in the sense that article is about, or that study is about how there are all these external forces that kind of shape the type of research that people do. And the sort of incentive structure of academia is such that people have more incentive and it's safer to do less risky research, to do research that's more likely to get published, which means it's less kind of out there or whatever. You often choose what to do with your limited time based on what you think is going to get published, right? But fair enough, that's the system. This is now the sort of political economy side of it. Like, this is also all of these big corporate sort of commercial things that are going on. The dominance of these journals also really shapes the kind of research that people do, right? So again, research is not simply clever people going to solve problems, right? It's clever people going to solve problems, but with all these constraints that often push them towards working on stuff that's probably not as valuable as the stuff that they could produce if they had different incentives. Like, valuable for, the improvement of quality of life for everyone on Earth. Like, that's ultimately where anything that we're sort of aiming for should be improving people's lives as broadly as possible. And we could do that a lot better if we weren't sucked in or trapped in this sort of cycle. It's really, really sad. Now, we won't go into this too much. I won't even go into that part there. We're sort of getting on for time here, and I want to make sure we've got a little bit of a time to just glance at the other article. This is a good line here. Public knowledge and education is a human right. It should not come with a profit tag of 35%. Where are our political leaders and where are the sector leaders? Well, I suppose that's what this was about. There has been some resistance, but even in the Netherlands, the whole country said to Elsevier, like, we basically want a fair deal. We want an open deal, rates at the same as last year for our guys to publish in so that we can budget properly. And then basically Elsevier said, no, we're not going to do that, and wound up cancelling the subscriptions. Because Elsevier probably looked at it and thought, if we capitulate to the Netherlands here, everyone else is going to ask us to do the same. So what we need to do is be ruthless and deny the Netherlands access to anything. Say, well, okay, you've cancelled your subscription, so that the business model wasn't disrupted. These are high-level sort of corporate board decisions that will have been made by people who, sort of legally obliged to make decisions in the best interest of shareholders of the company. This is the perverse dynamic. It's just like communism works in theory to say that sort of competing self-interests will sort of ultimately lead to the greater good. but it really doesn't sort of work like that.
And on that note, about resistance and trying to disrupt, my former employer, the University of California, which for those of you who don't know is a system of universities. It's about 10 universities that operate as a state-funded collective in California. UCLA, UC Davis, UC San Francisco, so forth. So as a kind of group of universities, they have a huge amount of power, and they, thankfully, I was really pleased as a former employee to see, they've decided also to take a stand, and they cancelled all of their subscriptions to, was it just Elsevier, Jack, or was it Elsevier, Springer, and like I think it might have been the big.
Yeah, I can't recall the details of it.
I'll have to look it up, but yeah, they took the brave option of saying, you know what, these are some of the top journals in the world. We're not going to subscribe to them because we believe this is an immoral use of money that's supposed to be for producing knowledge. I'll look it up now.
So while Alex is doing that, this is the other one, the other piece. Again, looks a little bit different as a PDF, but and it's cut off here.
I have to say, like, this guy, Robert Maxwell, is what a character, what an amazing figure, but also, yeah, at some levels, like, what a slimeball, like, what a shady, dodgy character he was, and one of the chief proponents of the current academic publishing industry, essentially.
Craig, I saw you laughing there. Had you ever heard of Maxwell before this? Yeah.
Yeah, yes, I did. A very flamboyant character. Was not British, but had a very British upper crust accent that he cultivated, and he made a lot of money. And I think he wasted a lot of money too.
Yeah.
I think he bought some football teams or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, was it Liverpool? Was it Liverpool or Aston Villa? Or it was a big football team that he bought.
I don't know, but yeah, he was a very interesting character.
Yeah. So, all right, what everyone should be doing is, now that you've got that big picture in your head, this article is a really great kind of case study of Robert Maxwell and sort of the origins of the contemporary hyper profitable publishing industry. So it's really important that you read this again for your, like, this is the kind of thing, hopefully, that informs even your reflective learning essay. Like, what have you learned about how research fields develop, right? That's that question. And one of the things that you've learned in this unit is that, like, crap, there's all of this, like, serious, like, big league economic stuff going on that pressures researchers towards certain kinds of research and certain kinds of arrangements that are, at the very least, discrepant with some of the ideals of research. So some of it's repetitive, which is actually kind of helpful, right? Some of this lead-in stuff. This is about an 7,000 word piece, right? So it's kind of longer. And just for comparison, they say successful magazines typically make profits of 12 to 15%. Here again is like a little overview. I won't read that for you because I think we should probably move on. But it's basically like the thing from Brian Nosek. It's like, basically everyone does volunteer stuff, and then the publishers sell back the product to government-funded institutional university libraries to be read by scientists who created it in the first place. The state funds most of the research, pays the salaries of most of those checking the quality of the research, and then buys most of the published research. And so the state is good because that includes both, like, government and the university and whatever. Now, the thing to look at here is there's quite a lot of this intro preamble that's similar to the Schmidt article, and then you get to this. These stories are in, like, usually 3 or 4 sections, and here you get to Robert Maxwell. Bit of biography on the guy, and this is the important historical context, though. We're talking here just after the Second World War, right? World's about to get rebuilt. If you're in the West, things are going to get pretty good overall. Science was about to enter a period of unprecedented growth, having gone from being a scattered amateurist pursuit of wealthy gentlemen to a respected profession. In the post-war years, it would become a byword for progress. You know, think about like the Cold War and like the whole sort of science and technology paradigm.
Why Boone published the work that he did at the time that he did. It was the same part of the same cultural impetus to understand science.
Yeah, exactly. 1950s, Kuhn started publishing on that stuff, and you know, we're still talking about it today with Foster et al. And those kinds of things. Vannevar Bush, central to the kind of he was the supervisor of the guy that kind of invented the digital computer. Really fascinating guy. And then here though, like they realized that as science expanded, they'd need new journals to cover new areas of study. The scientific societies that traditionally created journals were unwieldy institutions that tended to move slowly, hampered by internal debates between members about the boundaries of their field. So that's super RD1. Ribot, who's this? Rosebud? I'm not sure actually. Rosbord had none of these constraints. All he needed to do was convince a prominent academic that their particular field required a new journal to showcase it properly and install that person at the helm of it. Incentive, incentive, incentive. In case you didn't catch that, incentive, incentive, incentive. And so they started to do this. Where's the...
Tell us how they did it.
Yeah. Maxwell took this model and just put it on steroids, right? Scientific conferences tended to be drab, low-ceilinged affairs. That's pretty funny, drab and low-ceilinged. But when Maxwell returned to the Geneva conference that year, he rented a house in the nearby Cologne-Belle-Rive, a picturesque town on the lakeshore, where he entertained guests at parties with booze, cigars, and sailboat trips. Scientists had never seen anything like him. He always said, we don't compete on sales, we compete on authors. Why? Because authors are giving them the product for free. They can't believe their luck. Couple of $1,000s on a fancy weekend is nothing compared to the millions of dollars you'll make, right? We would attend conferences specifically looking to recruit editors for new journals. There are tales of parties on the roof of the Athens Hilton or gifts of Concorde flights, of scientists being put on chartered boat tour of the Greek islands to plan their new journal. Like, just think about how disgusting this is. They're dangling all these privileges to a couple of people at the top of a field so that those people get enough compensation that they're happy to promote a model where these guys make squillions and squillions of dollars off stuff that's funded by the taxpayer. Like, it drives you insane. You know, if you think Alex and I, if you wonder why we're so ranty all of the time, it's this stuff in particular, because this is where all of our work goes. Like, all of the work of the academy gets funneled through this corporate pipeline. So just to kind of round this out, one of the, there's the man himself. I was going to use a different word. There's the man himself. Died in mysterious circumstances too. Fell off a boat, I think. And it was unclear.
I read his biography over the summer holidays.
It was Mossad, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, no. It probably was the case that he was on his private boat going from Spain to Ireland for a board meeting. And halfway between Spain and Ireland, he was asleep in the middle of the night. He got up, needed to do a wee. Instead of going to the toilet, he decided he'd wee off the side of the boat. While weeing, had a heart attack and fell into the ocean. He was dead before he hit the water. They found his body a few days later. Nice graffiti.
Now he's got the devil horns he deserves. So one kind of really important way to illustrate this, or good case study, is the journal Cell. Right, this is like super prominent. Anyone kind of remotely near biology knows about this journal, and it's and so look at this. Nobody took much notice at the start of this guy's career. Nobody took notice really where you were published. It was like it was in a journal somewhere. But that everything changed in 1974 with Cell. So this is like a paradigm shift of sorts in the academic publishing world. Suddenly, it's really fascinating when you can date things precisely like this. Like, you can, one fancy sort of theoretical way to say this is you can like historicize the tendency of journals to I'm losing words here. I'm going to abandon that actually. Let's.
But this is a really interesting moment in biological research, right? Because in the 1960s, following the Monterey and the Miramar conferences about genetic research, biology, that part of biological research that had to do with DNA was starting to really, people could see that it was going to explode very soon. It's interesting that Foster et al. Also chart the rise of DNA in their DNA as a subject matter in the article that we looked at for them in week 6 too. But so the reason why people are becoming interested in journals like Cell commercially in the early 1970s is because they can see what's coming in terms of genetics research.
And look at this next part too. Like so this is the newly ascended field of molecular biology, right? But look at this part. It was edited by a young biologist named Ben Lewin, who approached his work with an intense, almost literary bent. Lewin prized long, rigorous papers that answered big questions, often representing years of research that would have yielded multiple papers in other venues. And breaking with the idea that journals were passive instruments to communicate science, he rejected far more papers than he published. What he created was a venue for scientific blockbusters, and scientists began shaping their work on his terms. Like hashtag Foster et al. Hashtag clear example of how research agendas are shaped not simply by the need to solve problems, but also the need for the work you do in solving those problems to make you a living.
And the cultural and social norms of the context in which you're doing the work. Like you are shaped by your surroundings.
This is why we always like, you know, the idea that science is not like just this pure objective enterprise. Like it's like you can do deeply rigorous, transparent work that is like sort of what most people mean by objective, but like all of this stuff gets into it too. And this guy wanted, like, you know, think about this, that like he's made a choice that like, no, the way I want knowledge presented in this journal is not piecemeal. I want it to have a literary kind of feel to it in the sense of a good big story, applying like world-class rigor to a really big problem. And to do that means linking it rhetorically, not just telling us the data, like that it's got to have like a good cohesive feel to it, right? So again, like all of this stuff is what shapes research. So yeah, again, it kind of goes on and on. We won't read it. I don't think I flagged any more for us to look at here, because it's sort of repetitive, at least for our purposes. So I think we should leave that.
Worth reading the whole thing though, guys. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and again, like it goes to stewardship. Like what we want from you guys is to demonstrate both in your reflective learning essay and in your ethics essay for RD2 next semester, like demonstrate your awareness of the challenge, the pressures that are imposed upon any and all researchers. And, you know, most people really value those notions of stewardship. We do research, not just to pass the time, but to improve the world. And understanding these dynamics are part of that.
So Jack, Kerry has asked us if we can give some good news now.
Oh, no, there's no good news, Kerry. No, actually, well,
there is some good news. There is some good news. And the good news is that people like Jack and I and people like you guys aren't alone. There are quite a number of researchers, scholars, scientists, all around the world who want to deconstruct this model of academic publishing and move with a more grassroots-led model that that tries to favour fame and reputation less, and favours substantive work more, and that doesn't participate in a for-profit model of publication. So what do we want to do? We should dwell a little bit upon that, but maybe we can dwell upon it in conversation.
Yeah, that'd be great.
We should have a bit of a break first too.
Yeah, or maybe we should have a little bit of a quick break, because then we can have a conversation about some of this stuff and then fold it out into RD1 generally. I would like to draw attention to Xiaodong's comment. This is the most absurd business model I've ever heard. Perfect for problem with minimum cost. Very much agree. Yeah, so should we take a 5-minute break and come back at 11 past 11? The 11th minute of the 11th hour. All right, cool. Well, we'll see you guys in 5 minutes then. Rock and roll, everyone. Well, we're all warming back in. I think I'm a few seconds early here, so no rush. I realize that I probably should have paused the recording, but hopefully if anyone's watching it, they've skipped through sufficiently. It's great to see so many people here as well. 47 participants. Like, I have to confess that that's, I suppose, more people than I thought would show up. So that's lovely. You guys have been really impressively engaged. It's been really great to see. Like, we had a really good vibe off you all in week 0 before there was any sense that things would go the way they did. But it's been really, really pleasing to see. Everyone's obviously dealing with all kinds of additional pressures and struggles that have been caused by the pandemic. But the vast majority of people are still really, really engaged, and it shows that you guys all, you guys chose to be here. That's the really nice thing about teaching the MRes versus, say, undergraduate. Because in undergraduate, you get a lot of people floating through degrees who aren't necessarily going somewhere with it or whatever. But in MRes, everyone's chosen to come and do something that they're interested in. So that, like, intrinsic motivation makes all the difference to learning. And that's why MRes cohorts, I mean, they're always good. They're always fun. They're always it's always noticeably better than undergraduate teaching because people are there willingly to do something serious too. And everyone's had a bit of training at uni, so kind of people know what's going on a bit. And yeah, so just wanted to say thanks to everyone for being here. Let's open it up to questions, and let's start. Let's say that at least by, say, 20 to 12, if we haven't, we'll kick over to general RD1 questions. But that gives us half an hour if we want to do some discussion about this. If we run out of discussion of this, then we'll flip over to RD1 generally. But what questions do people have? And that can be anything about details about the publishing industry, or like thoughts, or like what are the moral considerations of this particular issue, or like, I don't know, sort of let's open it up to people. You can jump in on voice sort of organically, or if people want to throw comments in the chat, we can deal with that too. But maybe does someone want to kick us off with a verbal question of some kind, or comment, reflection, anything like that?
So what's the solution to this this whole publishing industry? How do we go about it then?
Good question, Samir. Let's deal with that. Firstly, what are some of your thoughts on that question?
I think that reflects back to Foster, whether we just stick to the tradition in order to get the reward. Do we just go about just accepting that that's the world we live in, and that's the whole dominion of research? Should we just go with the flow and just have to sign off our intellectual labor off to these big publishing companies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what you're invoking there is the sort of collective, like, what do we do collectively? Because I think it's pretty clear to everyone that one, as with many big structural problems, one person's actions can definitely lead to wider change, but usually in themselves aren't sort of addressing the structural problem. So let's agree that we need some kind of collective solution. So let's build on Samir's comment and get a few input from a few others here. What are some things that, let's call it the academic community, like assuming that the vast majority of people involved in that around the world are people who want better social justice outcomes for research, right? Let's assume that. What could the academic community do, or the various the subcultures within research, the research world? What are some kinds of things that we can do we might be able to do on various scales, do you think? It's fine if you're wondering. You don't have to tell us, you don't have to know, but like, if you're thinking, well, what about this or that? What are some thoughts here?
Jack?
Yeah, Julie, go for it.
So this might not be popular to say, and at my age, though, I think I get to say this kind of stuff. I think there's a degree of social emotional capacities that we need around courage, around trust, around collaboration, creativity, that we don't really talk about so much, as far as I can tell, in the academy. Anyway, let's
stay with that. That's good. You're I think right to some extent. I heard a great phrase the other day that I don't think I'd heard, which is that courage is a muscle. And I think that probably applies to a lot of those things that you talked about: creativity, collaboration, trust sort of comes out of that, a lot of that stuff. But would I be
communication is another one.
Communication, yep. And in some senses, would you agree, thinking about what you're saying, that I agree we don't really talk about that stuff much in academia, and it feels like there's kind of just a presumption that doing the research is good. You do research equals good. Sort of almost in the same way that like make profit, GDP growth equals better country. Like it's really way overly simplistic, and there's a lot more to it. So once again, this is why we do what we do in the MRes, to try and throw these notions of stewardship at you guys, so that as part of your research training, you're not just told, go research, product equals good. We're telling you that you as humans have all these responsibilities, and it's really tough and challenging. But it needs people like you guys to be thinking about these issues and bringing that in your own, to whatever extent you can, your own work that you produce, the teaching work that many of you will go on and do as a result of being researchers. So what about, let's build from those comments from Julie and Samir. What are some further things that, what are, say, some practical things that might occur, like thinking about what I think was Sandal said, or Sandal said, about how, you would need a new system of credibility. Let's talk more about that. What are some people's ideas on that? What might that look like? What's which to be a bit clearer, what's an opposite version or a different version to a world where researchers want to publish really only in highly prestigious journals that are all for profit? Like, what's a different world look like, where people want to publish in something that doesn't contribute to the problem in the same way?
And one of the additional questions, or another way of iterating what Jack has said, is what is credibility in this context?
Any thoughts on that?
So Julie's asking about, are there any different models coming out in the arts or the humanities? Interestingly, I think, is your read the same as mine, Jack? I think the resistance to this comes more from the sciences than the humanities. The sciences and the social sciences, much stronger resistance to the current publishing model than the humanities.
Well, yes, certainly the stuff that goes out and about on the internet tends, like, I think that probably everyone in the humanities will be equally concerned and outraged. And there's lots of feelings of marginalization in the humanities, the whole sort of impact paradigm where people feel like valuable research is not actually valued in the current model. So, but yeah, there seems to be less organized resistance to the model from the humanities sort of side.
Yeah, that's a better way of saying it. Less organized resistance. There is organized resistance in the sciences and social sciences. I'll look up some links for you guys. Cool.
So we've got Alex, then Jay here. So Alex is saying, wouldn't the ideal be a unified open access journal database that curates and publishes on a global scale, essentially the conversation but for journals? Great question, Alex. Something we didn't mention was the directory of open access journals, the DOAJ. So I don't know if someone wants to just throw that URL in the chat so everyone can grab it. That actually is like the most conspicuous effort to do something like what you're talking about, Alex, actually, which is that you can register in this database so that's the Center for Open Science. And then, yeah, cool, great, thanks, Jay, awesome. The DOAJ, if you have a look at it, there's about 10,000 journals, and there's different types of open access as well. There are some that are full open access. There's another version of open access, though. We didn't talk about this. That's really sinister. That it looks open. It's open to you as a member of the public, right? But to become open access,
open to the end user.
Open to the end user, but the authors have to pay for that. So like it's usually several $1,000s, right? So I remember the very first time I signed up, I did a book review. It was a crappy little book review, crappy little journal, whatever. But I had to sign off like, yeah, here's my copyright, whatever. I had the option to make that journal, that book review, open access for, I think it was $3,500. And the reason that they do that is a lot of the time it's really sinister. The publishing companies know that a lot of funded research now, grant funded research, actually has a requirement that things are open access. The publications are open access, which sounds like, okay, great. Well, the government's made that stipulation. But what happens is then that fee is built into the funding, right? So that, you might plan for $5,000 to publish the paper. So it doesn't solve the problem at all because the taxpayer is still paying for it, right? And the analogy that I use, what's that?
Paying for it twice.
Paying for it twice, yeah. And the analogy that I use is that my friend's dad was a taxi driver and he was interested in insurance costs. So he did a bit of a experiment where he went around to half a dozen people and with a problem with his car and told them that insurance was paying for it. And then he went around to another bunch of people and said, I'm paying for it privately. What kind of price can you do for me? And obviously when the insurance companies are paying, everyone was going to charge more because they know they can get more out of the insurance companies, right? So it's a bit like that with the publishing industry. They can just jack up the open access fee because they know that the only people they really care about are people who could build it into the grant. So there's I can't remember the code they use on DOAJ. I think there's like 3 different types of open access. Like the gold standard for open access morally is that the author doesn't pay and the end user doesn't pay. So it's, I guess one question is how, there's 10,000 journals on there. It's not insignificant. What would need to happen culturally in the world of academia for the whole system to say, you know what, we're not going to reward people for publishing in locations that charge for knowledge, especially this exorbitant amount. What would that take? Because if one group does it alone, it's not going to work. It's going to be like Elsevier in the Netherlands. Elsevier is going to stand their ground and say, no, that's too dangerous for us.
Well, what about, sorry to interrupt, Jack, but I've just had an idea. Something like Google, like a company that has an enormous amount of capital and influence on the planet, would probably have to do something about this. Is that an option? I know that.
What do you mean?
Google's got its own issues, absolutely. But I'm wondering if something or a company that already has a large amount of influence says that's enough, and then they take on and open access all of these studies.
So are you saying they have to be the leaders? Like lead the way?
Yeah,
Okay.
Thanks, Samir. That's a much better way to put it. Yeah, I'm wondering if there needs to be, unfortunately, it's capitalism can really only beat capitalism. So maybe we need a really big company such as Google or even Microsoft, or one of the really big guys who have a lot of influence, might have to take something like this on.
That's a really interesting idea. My thought is, though, that Google could only ever be a partner in the sense that because Google is not, the ultimate sort of customer here is the university or the public, depending how you want to look at it. And what it needs is for assuming the researchers are drawing salaries from a university, that you would probably need Google to partner with you. I can't see how Google would do it on its own.
No.
It would have to be in partnership with universities, though, maybe to help create a platform. And
that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, and they couldn't retrospectively make things open access because there are contractual obligations. But it could be the case. You could have a partnership between universities of the world, Google, and the Directory of Open Access Journals, for instance. The problem, though, with anyone like Google or Microsoft is that they're subject to the same dynamic of an imperative to maximize shareholder value. Now, with Google, though, it might be the case that, if a product is free, then you are the product. That's the idea.
Yes.
If you don't pay for it, you are the product with your data. So Google probably is big enough that there might be a strategic advantage for it to be the place where free research happens. But that would only be in Google's interest if it ultimately increased its revenue overall. So, you know, I flinch at the idea of, you might be right that only capitalism will defeat capitalism, except that I wouldn't want to run down that path until the more kind of not-for-profit consortium approaches had been sort of taken or exhausted. And, you know, you can build open access networks. You sort of, like DOAJ, like, you know, you don't need a Google, but what you need is the credibility, the social capital, the recognition. So it's like, how does a new model of publishing generate that? And this is where, if, like, we didn't talk much about social capital and symbolic capital and those things, like from Pierre Bourdieu in Foster et al. But if you think about symbolic capital, like, imagine if senior people who have the most capital in their field, Stephen Hawking as an example, imagine what happens when the Stephen Hawkings of every discipline gather for a meeting, like the opposite of a diabolical meeting. Let's imagine like an enlightened love-in, and they and they say, we are going to use our symbolic capital as leaders of the field, and our social capital, our influence, our networks with so many people in the field, to say, no, this is gross. Guys, here are some new platforms. We now formally declare that anyone who doesn't use these platforms is morally culpable, and here is an indictment against the publishing companies, and here are their base costs, and here is what it would look like if they were a reasonable business model, and that's it. And, you know, like, you can see how basically impossible that level of coordination across the disciplines is, because it's like, you know, if you take a stand, then someone will just come in and wipe you out.
Do you think we're going? Sorry.
No, you go, Samir. There's a couple of comments.
I just wanted to ask, do you think the vast amount of academic journals out there, I don't remember the exact amount there were, do you think we're heading into an information overload because of the amount of journals that are out there, and it's going towards like the internet? Then there's so much information out there that there might be an overload due to, yeah, that was one of my questions. Yeah, I should say. Yeah.
It's a good question, Samir. And yes is the short answer. There's obviously this massive glut of papers now. It's so much easier to publish that there are so many more. There was something really interesting in here. This is, again, that report that talked about the profit levels of the publishing industry. Look, this was really interesting. So this is from 2015, so fairly current. Reading patterns are changing. So journal articles are still the key currency, but reading patterns are changing, with researchers reading averaging 270 articles per year, depending on discipline, more in medicine and science, fewer in the humanities and social sciences, but usually longer articles in those things, but spending less time per article, with reported reading down from 45 to 50 minutes to 30 minutes, right? So there's a lot more skimming going on, a lot more. There's the same amount of hours in the day. What were you saying, Alex?
That's a real problem intellectually. Because there's a kind of time on task that's necessary to be able to do problem solving. And if you're, and problem solving here, like the problem, when you're reading an article, the problem that you're solving is the problem that the authors solved. You're trying to solve it with them. That's how you learn what they did. And if your time on that task is reduced, then that means the intellectual labor is less, like you are less intellectually engaged. And I would worry about scholarship and scientific work that engages less. And that's the fundamental problem of publishing so much. And we haven't gotten into even really the incentive, like the publish or perish model in academia, because everything was set up to make publishing so easy. And because it was in the interests of the publishing houses to publish a lot, because the more that they published, the more profit they would gain. Coincident with that rise in for-profit publishing has been the rise of the notion that as an academic, you need to publish as frequently as possible. In my career, the start of my career as an academic was the end of the quality over quantity era. And I started my career as an academic in the quantity over quality era. That is, what mattered more was that you published a lot of journal articles. Didn't matter where they were. Like the idea was that you would publish in high quality journals, but more was better than none, you know?
Yeah, again, it's just incentives. Like people, like think about how bad that is for the whole like sector of knowledge production.
There's
Everyone involved in it.
Crap papers out there because of this. I also want to kind of throw back here to the guys, because there's a heap of really good questions and suggestions coming through.
Just very quickly before we do, one tiny other thing to note here, just based on what came up before. They talk about peer review. The typical reviewer spends 5 hours per review and reviews some 8 articles per year. So there's 40 hours that they give for free to the publishing company.
That's 2% of a person's workload for calculated purposes.
Yeah, sorry. Let's come back to some of these comments that were here. We
Craig, what is?
Yeah, we had Mark's got a big comment here as well, which would maybe Craig jump in and then we'll go to Mark and roll.
Okay. Just to try and give you a slightly different perspective on reading things. I run an organisation, and I get upwards of 100 emails a day, and that's just the emails that you have to read. And if anybody sends me an email now that is a wall of text, I don't read it. I don't have the time. And what has happened over time is that my ability to do a slow read has decreased markedly, as my ability to actually write something.
Me
because,
too.
Yeah, you just don't get the time. And if people write, more than a page, I've got the attention span of a gnat now. Well, hopefully that's changing as I do this course. But it's just that, you can see how this just moves you in this one direction, which is the opposite of actually what you want to do. And that statistics that you had there, where it went from 45 to 50 minutes to 30 minutes, precisely.
Yeah, it's a real issue, and people like researchers themselves have exactly the same problems. It's really troubling. Like we're sort of caught in a loop that we can't get ourselves out of. So Mark said, where is the academic culpability in all of this? It's academics who have decided that getting published in certain journals is good for their career, not the publishing houses. Yeah. My biggest takeaway from reading these articles was that academics were unable to publish their own work. And then when someone else did it, it was their hubris that fueled the need for publication in specific journals. I think that's broadly accurate in the sense that academics were offered incentives that were good for them, but clearly on a broader view of like cost benefit to society, this is an awful model to pursue. When this problem comes up, the big thing that comes to my mind is sort of the problem of human psychology, like the discrepancy between our ideals of always acting right and like the clear tendency for people when they can gain a small advantage for themselves to do so. Which is, one of the tendencies that sort of democracy and law and all those things are designed to sort of curb to some extent. So you raise a really important issue though, and it goes to like kind of the same thing we were talking about before, the senior academics who could come out and take a stand against this stuff, right? And lead the charge and kind of, I think whatever happened, you need to do it collectively. I'm not saying people shouldn't break away if they feel they must. And there are probably ways of participating in the system while being very critical of it, which lots of people do. But it's sort of an unsolvable problem in some senses, I feel, Mark, that it's a fundamental problem of human psychology that we're dealing with there, and sort of human behavior and the way we're formed as humans. It's not that maybe it's not human nature per se, but our cultural education under conditions of kind of, market capitalism, highly individuated market capitalism, presumptions of social justice that are really sort of just, in many cases, things that make markets better.
I'd agree with you if we were talking about 14-year-old children, but we're not. We're talking about grown adults who, and the first thing you gave us to read was the statement by Gould. It's like, look, this is about academic stewardship. And that is supposedly what academics would want going into this particular field. And like I say, if we were talking about 14-year-old children, it's like, oh, you get your name in lights. It's like, yeah, all right, I'll sign up for that. But we're talking about adults here. We're talking about people who have set out because they want to do good work. And then the first opportunity that comes along, it's like, we can make you better than the other guy. They're like, yeah, sign me up. It's like, well, no, hang on a minute. You're an adult, all right? And you have a choice. And again, this might be a controversial opinion, but just reading through that, particularly the Guardian article, there were so many points that jumped out at me. It's like, look, this is down to a naivety from the academy on how these things work, and vanity. And the biggest sentence for me in the entire article was Maxwell knew the market better than the academics. It's like that summed up the entire, whatever problem you have with any of this, to me, it's like, goes back to the academics. It's like they started it, they caused it, and they fuel it. And so you might not like that opinion, but if you want to change it, I would say that's where it's got to start at the academics. And I think this open access thing is a good start. It will require more and more universities and more people who lead the field to go, you know what, I'm going to start publishing here instead of there. And if you want to change it, that's how you've got to do it.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a nice encapsulation of what would need to happen. And I certainly don't want to slander any colleagues or anything, but I will share with you as a general impression of working in academia now for about 7 years since I started tutoring. I've been really, I guess, like horrified is too strong if I'm trying to be serious. I've been really, really deeply disappointed and let down by the total vacuity of ethics and morals by the vast majority of people in the sector. In the sense that there is it is exactly the same, it seems to me, as any other field of human activity. There is the fact that it's research and it's kind of ostensibly grounded in all these lofty values. There's just this massive discrepancy. It's like the United States talking about freedom. It's just that the discrepancy between the ideal and the reality is just, it's really distressing to me. I've totally lost faith in the university as not in researchers, but in the university as a mechanism. I think it's too subject to the cultural rationality that pervades kind of the world in many ways for it to really change, because I don't think, again, we sort of assume we risk major disappointment if we assume that humans are as moral as we say we are.
Yeah.
Which is not, not to disagree with you, Mark, at all. I guess I'm just saying I agree with your analysis and the proposed solution. And sadly, I don't see it changing.
Yeah, well, does that to me begs the question, is if so many academics and so many universities are on board with this, do they see it as a problem?
Many don't. Yeah. That's
the answer then, unfortunately.
Again, people benefit. It's not exactly like politics in the sense that re-election drives a lot of policy decisions. It drives a lot of political platforms, and people often takes longer than an office term to sort of walk another direction a lot of the time. And same in a lot of ways for senior leaders at the university who are on those sort of 5-year contracts. But there's also people who are embedded for a lot longer in academia who could take a stand, who've got a lot longer than an office term. And it is we don't want to discourage anyone from doing research, because there needs to be more sort of good, strong, ethically minded people in it. But it's important to understand that just in the same way that researchers are often pretty terrible at reading and writing, strange as that may sound, they're often just rank and file humans, which means like full of, you know, flaws and problems and this kind of moral apathy that pervades our species in a lot of ways. I mean, it's complex, of course. Like, of course, it's very complex, but it's a sad dynamic. It's a sad dynamic.
But also, I think as an industry, we haven't prioritized or valorized this kind of thinking about the industry as a whole. Various disciplines, to greater and lesser extent, have been concerned with their own trajectories and have managed themselves as disciplines or fields of research kind of better or worse in this regard in terms of publishing. Like astronomy is one of the great examples of a whole field that has profoundly resisted the commercial publishing model. But as a whole industry, like as a whole, like the whole kingdom of research, we haven't really done that. And certainly for you guys, that's one of the things that Jack and I, when we got together, we had no instruction from the university on this, but we decided, just like Mark pointed out, like there were so many moments in the history, there are so many moments in the history of this that individual people could have taken action and done something. And Jack and I decided, well, you know what, screw it. We're going to do something, however minor it is, which in this case is, you know, teaching, 46 people over Zoom.
About the ugly realities of it all.
yeah, about the ugly realities of it all. Because part of the problem is that people were never exposed to the ugly realities. That never kind of forced to think, even just for a moment, this is what it takes to produce the world that you think that you want. Is that really the world that you want? So that's why, I think this is I know for Jack it's probably the same. This is one of my favorite moments in the MRes, because we're really confronting deep problems in the assumptions about the way that we do the work that we want to do, and we never come out of it with answers, because part of the problem here is that this is a living kind of ongoing cultural thing that we need to correct constantly as we go forward. And we feel like giving you guys the kind of the most frank assessment as we see it is the best thing that we can do here. And so, like Mark, when you say like, isn't this academic culpability? I totally agree with you, and I feel the weight of that on my kind of shoulders too, because it's like participating in capitalism. It is participating in capitalism. You have no choice but to participate, but you can try and resist it at various points. And we try and, I hope that one of the things that we encourage here is thinking about some kind of resistance.
And
isn't this, sorry, Jack, isn't
go ahead,
this,
Craig.
I mean, it's a vicious cycle that we're all in, where, I mean, and I think of the majority of the people that are doing the MRes, probably quite a lot of them want to do a PhD, and it's about career progression and things like that. And to progress in their careers, as you've rightly said, it's publish or perish. You know, you've got to get stuff out. So they're on this treadmill, which is very much a capitalist model. And to cut across that, to stand up and say, well, actually, no, I'm not going to do this, means you don't get the jobs, you don't get those sorts of things, you don't get the kudos for publishing papers and speaking at conferences and things like that. I think it's great what you and Alex are doing in terms of standing up and saying, well, no, this isn't the right model. And I've heard Mark talk about, perhaps what the model it looks like, but we really don't have a how. How do we move this? How do we get off the vicious cycle that we're in? And I think that, to me, is a key question.
Yeah, I think you're right, Craig, and it goes to those cultural changes that we were sort of evoking. But I also just want to make one more point on the note that we don't talk about this stuff very often. It's a real frustration to me that this is the first time you guys are hearing about this, probably for most people. And also, like, it's distressing to me as a citizen in a democracy. It's distressing that that young researchers, or like, you know, not regardless of age, but like at the start of a career, why aren't supervisors going, whoa, no, don't be publishing? Do you know how much that journal like steals from the taxpayer? Like that is never a discussion like anywhere. I mean, it might happen around the place. I've never really, no students ever come to us and said, oh yeah, my supervisor really drilled that into me, that I need to be careful and think about the moral components of my choices. Like, because what they say in the article, one of them, I think it's Schmidt, is, and Mark, this is part of the problem as well, that people don't actually know either. Like, which is not to say they're not culpable, but like, it's so hidden. Like, kind of in the same way that most people, I think, don't fully understand how violent and brutal factory farming is. Like, they kind of know that animal production is not very nice, probably, but like, they don't really understand just how savage and brutal it is. I think that a lot of people understand that, the academic publishing companies kind of make a lot of money and it's all a bit, but I don't think most people know just how, like, sort of cynically awful the whole situation is. So yeah, again, that's awareness. Like, that's even before solutions. Like, what about awareness? Like, yeah, Julie.
I think this is in response to what you said, Jack, and to Mark. My sense of the academics that I know is they feel like victims of a system that's bigger than they are and that they don't really understand. It's what you're speaking to, that awareness. Yeah. And so much of their time is taken up on the bureaucracy of being within the system, that having an understanding of what's going on is just beyond them. And there's more and more pressures, as both of you have spoken about, of you and Alex have spoken about, there's more and more pressures on your time.
Yeah. It's a brutal cycle. Trapped, the amount of non-research work you have to, the amount of meaningless hours Alex and I spend in like meetings and this and that. Like, when we could be like prepare, we could have imagine if we had spent another 3-4 hours on this lecture to find a few more current financial reports and, like, you know, all those kinds of things that you can do with extra time that gets soaked up, and like with the meaninglessness of the work. And I don't know, like, I don't think there's anyone in ultimate control of the system either. Like, these big complex systems we set up and people kind of slot into them and work within their dynamics and shift and drive those dynamics, but like, no one's ultimately sort of in charge of things. It's just a big ugly mess. Courtney had said, well, we should start to round things down now, but Courtney had thrown in something. I think the lack of morals and values in this industry is due to the biological human nature of survival and every man for themselves. Yeah, although that goes to culture, because like there is, to be sort of a big debate in lots of sort of fields of study, from evolution to political theory, about this notion of the survival of the fittest. And that sort of came out as the popular conception of what evolution was after Darwin. I think it was Herbert Spencer who coined the term. But there's also an alternate strand. One of my favorite thinkers is a guy called Peter Krapotkin, who was like a sort of a turn of the century Russian anarchist guy. But he wrote this, he was like a biologist, and he wrote this fascinating book called Mutual Aid, which was about how sort of, yes, survival of the fittest, but it's the survival of the fittest groups, not the fittest individuals. Like, there is some individual kind of competition for trait dominance and stuff like that, but ultimately the successful species are ones that collaborate the most. And so for me, that boils down to basically, we could reframe the cultural narrative, which aligns with everything we've been sort of talking about here, that it's biology to some extent, but it is very much cultural. You know, we're not talking about full-scale socialism or anything sort of silly or overly simplistic, but there are...
Yes, we are.
No, we're just talking about like something that's slightly less awful now, just some of the low-hanging fruit of the complete awfulness. But, you know, it sort of means that people with power now will lose that power, and no one gives that up freely. So it's a political struggle as much as anything.
It is. Gloria's made a good point here. There are analogues with race, and I would say with gender too, that a big part of this here is what Jack noted just then, is giving up power. I'm not sure how to meditate on that further, but that strikes me as a good point, Gloria.
Yeah. So I mean, we could this is the kind of topic that you could talk about all night long, all day long. You know, there's so much going on. You sort of sway between solution and analysis. You know, analysis of the situation, critique, understanding, to like what could be done. And you know, Samir said that there's a sense, an impression that a lot of researchers don't take the notion of stewardship as strongly as we think probably one should, certainly not as much as we emphasize. And that's very much the case. We see that all over the university sector. You know, it's a real critical lack of stewardship, unfortunately. It's sort of a very privileged position socioeconomically, being a researcher, especially if you're stable, like as in got a contract, long-term contract. So yeah, it is really sad in a lot of ways. I've been, again, thoroughly disillusioned. I had to go through a process of what I called an emotional breakup with the university, which is sort of to say, really, it's very dangerous emotionally to think that the university is what it says it is, especially as a teacher, because then you give yourself to it. And it sucks the energy out of you, and it sucks as much time out of you as it can possibly do by overloading you with way more responsibilities than you should be given. So for you to do anything at good quality, you need to work way more hours than they are paying you to work. And you do that because of this vision of social justice and all that. And eventually you just get burnt out and sucked dry, because the university will just keep, like, there is nowhere near enough, like, we're nowhere near a critical mass of ethics and morality in the workplace.
As Inga Mewburn, who's known as the thesis whisperer, once very famously wrote, the university is a bad boyfriend. It will use you and leave you.
So take that, university.
And here's the relevant blog post I just chatted.
So, yeah, like maybe we can, unless anyone's got something new to add. We haven't addressed every single thing in the chat there, but hopefully people have been following that. It's great to see you guys using that. I didn't, just as a note, I didn't see any of those chat notes come in while we were doing the screen share. That's an annoying feature of Zoom. You can't see that. So yeah, if anyone has anything additional to add, we can. Otherwise, it might be good to spend the last few minutes here touching base about any RD1 questions. We can, I can linger a little bit past 12. I don't know if you can, Alex. But
well, yeah, I can too. Or should just for should we have a couple of minutes just kind of thinking about if anyone wants to contribute, like how could we do it differently? Like what could we do differently here in terms of publishing? If you want to share anything, then go
who's
ahead.
we here? Are we the whole thing again, or are we Western, or are we, who are we here?
This is I think for our purposes of discussion, this is we as stewards, as individual stewards of our various disciplines. What could we do as stewards of our disciplines to say, you know what, people in my field, we should do things differently, and here's one suggestion. Is that should we spend a couple of minutes kind of thinking about? I'm just trying to look for a kind of a slightly more psychologically positive exit strategy for the 2 hours, rather than kind of end on a kind of, oh God, everything's awful kind of note.
Just, yeah, let's even just dream. Let's not even, like, the constraint is like, you know, sort of technically possible.
Yeah, so Jay has been noting, so there was the IEEE free access stuff. It's worth noting that a number of publishers have done that during coronavirus. They've opened up a lot of their publications for free, just like everything else. It's like, yeah, we could actually support people socially. It's just that most of the time we choose not to. Money, exactly. And I posted the link to archive.org, which is where a lot of astronomy, mathematics, and computer science is published. When I said astronomy, astronomy is a weird field before. Astronomy kind of combines with maths, physics, and computer science these days. They blend together really intimately. And that collection of fields has been the strongest single kind of mass of resistance to for-profit publishing, largely because in the late 1970s, a few programmers got together and developed the tools for publication so that it made it easy for people to be able to publish their own work. I'm thinking particularly here of the typesetting language, LaTeX, as well as just being able to understand the mechanism of...
And it is an example of where, because there's a collective agreement in the field, you can bypass the normal publication system and have outputs that are recognized like for your career progression within that field, or within that, like that collection of fields. So it is a really powerful illustration that it can be done. They've sort of taken charge within their own, microcosm, appropriately enough for astronomy. But yeah, it is a good illustration. So everyone should go and have a look at archive.org, just to see what it looks like. You can even publish there without peer review. Like, people post stuff and it can then be sort of subject to open kind of review and critique. And, there's also the credibility of you as a researcher. You put stuff up that's not kind of particularly, that's not peer reviewed or not subsequently disproven, just, because you had done the process wrong or whatever, like, that's bad for you. But yeah. Cool. Courtney's got a question about development plan. We will come to that soon, Courtney. But yeah, any other thoughts? What else? What could be done? What's a dream set? What's a utopia? Or like a practical utopia? The real utopia is where we don't even need research because we know it all and we can go on being humans. Although that's kind of also horrifying. Heaven is a bit of an asymptote. Anyway, any other final thoughts?
Heaven is an asymptote. Sounds like the name of our third very difficult fusion rock album, Jack.
Yeah. What are you talking about, Jack? Does it take more time and actual engagement with other people and ideas? What do you mean there, Julie?
I was thinking when you were talking about the field of astronomy and how people will post things and they might not get peer reviewed, and then other people will come back and reflect on it or comment on it. Does that take a level of engagement that we have gotten away from, that it actually takes engaging with another person and their ideas in terms of their research and their thinking?
I mean, yeah, short answer would be yes, it does require that. And it sort of, I guess it means the field needs to have a culture of engagement. That's probably a better way to think about it, rather than individual people engaging with each other. Where there is more culture of engagement within a field, you're more likely to be able to develop and sustain an ecosystem like that, where, it's sort of fully credible, fully professional, but not subject to the same as outside some of those pressures.
Yeah, so I thought maybe I thought the tech industry, especially with code, is a good example of open access. I mean, for example, GitHub, most people would post their code online, and where you would get more credentials is if people either fork from it, star it, like it, upvote it almost, and you can see who liked it to see if they're good representatives of not representatives, supporters, not supporters, highly, I can't really say, I forgot the word, but someone that's trustworthy.
Yeah. Yeah, that is an interesting example because it's not exactly a research field, but it's quite comparable in the sense that it's high level intellectual work within a certain paradigm, a certain set of rules and expectations and conventions and all of that.
And sharing is the primary mechanism there in the world of coding, where a lot of your cultural credibility comes from, as Jay says, things like GitHub or GitLab or Pastebin, or you're making your work available for others, and that's where you get your credibility as a program.
But maybe, but also, there's a different incentive structure at play there. As an academic, you're publishing primarily with a established framework of career progression in mind. And when it comes to code, I think it's probably a much wider field of people who are contributing to that. There are people who are just noodling around doing projects that kind of throw code up to GitHub. And then there's people who are programmers and who make their living as programmers, and for whom those kind of metrics and that kind of credibility and that kind of reputation converts into material resources with which they can keep programming.
I mean, I use GitHub on my resumes all the time, and they always look at it. So yeah. Yeah. So it's a really interesting analog to think about. And I mean, they can also profit off it by using the MIT license, which allows, if someone used your code for commercial use, they will have to negotiate a term of agreement with you.
Yeah,
So,
it's a really good. I don't think we've talked about code in this connection before, but it's fascinating in its similarities and its differences. They sort of are both revealing.
Jay, what's your field? As I understand, is it security?
yeah, cybersecurity and either smart grids or digital fraud. So I haven't narrowed it down yet. So I think by the time I give you the proposal, I have something. Yeah.
Well, should we skip over to the proposal then, being sort of 12? Is there anything else?
And I just want to say that I think the general discussion here is heartening, you know, for me, because I think one of the things that we emphasize is human engagement and contact, that one of the ways to resolve this problem is for us to find ways to connect with each other variously in our fields of research. But also it strikes me that one of the ways to resolve, if the corporate model of publication is a problem, I think it is, then one of the ways to resolve it is to move back to more of a, maybe not a self or vanity production model, but something that resembles things like the way coders share code. That is where you can produce your own work and make it public for others to scrutinize it on its own kind of terms and values. It's a kind of it's a very pluralized way of producing work. The interesting thing, though, is that we've developed these cultural norms about review and peer review. I should say that they're as new as the academic publishing industry. You know, peer review is only, what is it, Jack, 60 years old or something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
Like there's every kind of sense that we could move to a community peer review rather than a kind of, you know, 2-on-1 peer review. And we haven't even gotten into the whole problem with peer review and the way that, while it is supposed to be, you know, objective and dispassionate and all of that, it still is subject to the same kind of politics and social problems as anything else, because of course it's groups of humans doing stuff. So the positive note for me is like, you know, as you go away with this as researchers, think about like, how can we kind of take, I guess it's that I'm kind of, that gesture that I'm feeling here is like, how can we take ownership of our publication in our field, so that on the one hand, it's produced very efficiently for us, because we don't want to kind of get bogged down in the production of text more than we have to. But on the other hand, to still ensure, and this is one of the positives of corporate publication, is that it helps to get research to where it can be used. So distribution network is one of the big challenges for us, I think. So can we produce it locally and distribute it globally is...
yes, you can.
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Yes, you can.
Problem solved.
Well, I mean, we have some really good models for this type of activity where you do need to be able to make a profit, but the organisation needs to be not-for-profit. So you've got to be able to continue to obviously build up a corpus of funds to be able to promote things and do things, but you also want the peer review. And it's, what are the structures and how are people paid in that sort of structure? So you've still got to be able to make money, but hopefully the profits, instead of going into some people's pockets, the shareholders, they actually get redistributed into doing more research and funding more things. And if you look at the amount of money that these publishing places are getting, that would fund a lot of research.
There's the utopia I'm talking about, Craig.
Well, the model's here. The model exists. And it doesn't have to change a lot of that corporate model to make it not for profit. It just needs, I think, drivers to actually say, okay, this is where we need to go with this. We need to take control of our own destiny and do it this way. we don't have to actually reinvent the wheel so much. It's just saying, let's make it not for profit for the members, make it a for-profit company that then redistributes that money elsewhere.
It's beautiful.
Thank you very much.
We might get you on the board of that company too, Craig.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah. But not for profit, like that does strike me as a really interesting way to go. Like, is it as simple as that? Maybe it is. Maybe we could just do much the same, but just move to not for profit rather than for profit. And
so you just need the recognition.
Like presumably there would be an injection of something like, well, if the global market back in 2015 was 25 billion, then presumably there would be an injection of some billions of dollars back into research.
Assuming that enough people gave it credibility to, ultimately it all just comes down to what humans recognize as prestigious. Anyway, I think we should probably move on to some questions because I'm conscious that other people might only have scheduled 2 hours. So far, I think we've got 2. We've got Courtney and then we have Rahab. So Courtney, you had a question about the structure. Tell us, what's the question?
Well, I was talking to my supervisor and she was kind of a bit confused, and I kind of was because normally what she would see is the structure, because currently it's project like description, then background, methodology, and impact. But she was explaining it to me and it kind of did make more sense for it to be like background, because background first, because you're you kind of introduce the topic and set up the background information, and then through that you identify the gap in the research, then present how your gap's gonna fill this and the project description, the impact of it, and then this is how I'm gonna do it. So I've been just struggling to make that structure that you set out flow like that other way would. So I wanted to kind of know why it's set up that way.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of points. No, the first note is that this is one of the challenges, of course, in the MRes, where we've got to have a structure that people from every discipline do. It's interesting. I haven't heard much of that. People kind of going, this structure is a little odd. Most people it seems to be fine, although maybe they just don't tell us. I would say that the way to think about it, probably the RD2 one is much more like what you're talking about, and they're actually the RD1 version is very similar. What's a bit different is that the project description is 250 words, which turns into 150 word abstract followed by 3,000 words. It's clearly that's the tiny little summary, which is RD2, and then you have a background section which leads to the sort of gap in the research question. You should still see the RD1 report like that. Just imagine that the project description effectively is an abstract, and that you are starting the report in the background section. So your supervisor will mark the 2 sections, the background and then the methodology, right? Project description is simply a summary of those 2 sections plus the impact statement, which means it's basically an abstract. Okay. So and one of the ways you can kind of see that, it might not be super obvious, but now that we're talking about it, is in the worksheet. It gives you a structure, or it gives you a set of things to talk about, which effectively is a structure. Sort of contextualize the topic for the reader. Your title will do a little bit of that work, but you sort of set the scene. You quickly outline the kind of context and the gap. You sort of then briefly explain what the project is going to do methodologically and what data it's going to look at and how it's going to be analyzed. And then you kind of talk about why it's important. You just briefly summarize the impact, which often kind of ties back to the way you've set up the problem. Not always, but so does that clarify it for you if you see the project description simply as an abstract?
Yeah, because I was having this picture in my head that it was that normally my abstract would come before all of this, and I feel like I would be repeating myself, sort of thing. So yeah, that makes more sense for sure.
Yeah, I'm just going to see if I can very quickly grab the worksheet here. That should be very quick to pull up, just so we can confirm for everyone what we're talking about here. So this is the A3 worksheet. this is the section we're talking about, the project description. So Alex and I, well, either myself, Alex Norman, or Alex Ray will be marking these sections.
Yeah, so I'm just sharing something with you guys now. This is a for realsies grant application. Just one of the ways we set this exercise up in RD1 and in RD2 is to simulate writing a proposal. So this is a real proposal submitted back in, there you go, 2016 by Chris Lonsdale. Chris used to work at Western Sydney, but he's now at ACU. I could explain that whole move. It was a big kind of thing. You can see a big project. What's up?
I accidentally, when I was on the swing, hit him in the face.
Oh, okay. Can you go and tell Mum? I'm just doing my class.
I didn't mean to do it.
That's okay. Do you want a cuddle?
I didn't mean to do it.
And so here it is. The first thing, guys, that you do, the title, who's on the team, where they're from, and then the proposal summary, which functions like an abstract, but it's a it's a description of the project. It doesn't set anything up. You can see it's very short, and I think that, Courtney, that's one of the things you're tripping up on, is the brevity of the kind of combination of, it's long enough to kind of describe the project, but not long enough for me to get into any detail. But then it's not way down until, oh wow, might be way down. Oh wow, it's 142 pages. Cool. So that's huge. Anyway.
Yeah. So what the trick for you guys is, the tip is these. So this is the section. It's the project description effectively. It's actually easier to do this in 250 words than 150, which is why we have it this way. Like 100, we have to train you a bit more in RD2 for the 150 to be easy. Here we give you a bit more space because we don't have quite, like, we could do a whole proposal writing unit, but that doesn't really happen till RD2. So this is basically a structure for you to follow. Like, somehow introduce the topic of the project, set up the context, which is the background and the gap, outline what you're going to do, sort of the aims, like what this is going to achieve, and then the impact significance. So you really are just summarizing these three sections. So work on those first.
Yeah, it's that last note, work on those first, which probably is one of the things that you're thinking about too, Courtney, is what to do. Like, you can't do the project description like properly. You can kind of sketch it, but the final thing that you submit, the project description, will be amongst the last things that you work on, because it will describe everything that comes below it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you.
We had a question from Rahab about assessment 2B. So those questions are not, but the better way to work out what we're asking is simply to look at the actual essay question in the worksheet. You're splitting up those three questions, I think. If I've lost the chat now, but I think you were splitting up those questions, Rahab. But they're not three separate questions. Like, they're sort of, I mean, you can take them as three sort of sub questions, but what we're looking for is for you to understand the broad type of question we're asking here. Like, looking back over semester, you've just been doing a whole bunch of work for 3 months. What have you learned about these things? All of these, research is the thing that humans do. This is stuff we've talked about. It's the whole kind of business of research sort of angle. How knowledge claims are made. We haven't spent as much time on this, but this is a lot of the claims and arguments work that you've been asked to think about in the reflective journal and, say, annotated bibliography and those kinds of things. And then also your own methodology, like planning for, like, you're going to be trying to produce some knowledge. How do people produce knowledge in your field? How do fields develop? Like, we've just been talking about that today. If you're in the field of, microbiology, molecular biology, if Cell is a relevant journal for you, you've just learned a lot about the history of your field. for instance, and how it developed. One of the really significant moments was when the journal Cell was established and Ben Lewin took editorial leadership of the journal. And this is illustrative of how things in other fields, you know, it's pretty easy once you lock onto the question. And then various factors that shape and constrain. So again, they're kinds of things I guess we've been talking about since week 0, but especially Foster et al. And then this week would be where we're talking about like constraints and external influences and things like that. So oh, I got the chat. Can I get the chat popped up here? Does that answer you, Rahab? Does that I'm not sure if that answers your question. And while we're waiting for that, just note everyone that we will give you up to week 14 without extension. No problem. So try and get it in week 12, but if you need a bit more time, there's no stress. Rahab says yes. All right, cool.
Yeah, so the note on dates, as with everything for RD1 this semester, is, you know, because of world, all dates are renegotiable.
Yeah. So are there any other questions? So before we get out of here, Craig's gone. Awesome, thanks, Craig. Anyone else? Anyone else? All right, let's make like a burrito and wrap it then. Wrap it up. Yes, thanks everyone. Thanks everyone. It was great. I might stop the recording now. So if you want to throw in your voice, actually turn yourself off mute and let's just say bye. Bye to the
Bye.
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 Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah.
I really like that cascade of byes.
Bye.